A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The rejection ceremony was supposed to be quick, supposed to be a formality that would release both parties from an arrangement that had never been based on love or mutual desire. But instead, Roland Blackthorne was taking his time, dragging out Celine's humiliation with the kind of cruel precision that suggested he'd been planning this speech for weeks, maybe months, while she'd been foolishly believing that their mating bond might actually happen despite the distance between them, and despite the way he'd been looking at her lately, with something that felt uncomfortably close to disgust. The entire Moonstone pack had gathered in the central clearing, a space usually reserved for celebrations and festivals and important pack business. But today, it had been transformed into something that felt more like an execution ground, with the way everyone was watching her, with a mixture of pity and relief. Pity because rejection was always painful to witness, and relief because it was happening to her instead of them. Because the strange, silver-haired Omega, who'd never quite belonged, was finally being cast out in the most official way possible, and they could all go back to pretending she'd never existed once she was gone. Celine stood in the center of the clearing, with her long silver hair hanging loose down her back almost to her waist, the metallic sheen of it catching the late afternoon sunlight in a way that made it look almost liquid, almost alive. And she'd learned over her 24 years to hate that hair, with a passion that burned in her chest like acid, because it was the most visible marker of her difference. The thing that made children point and whisper and made adults look away uncomfortably, as if her very appearance was something obscene that shouldn't be acknowledged in polite company. Her skin was porcelain pale, so pale that the blue veins at her wrists and throat were visible like delicate tracery under thin paper, and her eyes were an unusual violet gray that appeared almost lavender when the light hit them just right. And every single aspect of her appearance had been dissected and judged and found wanting for as long as she could remember, ever since her parents had died in a rogue attack when she was 7 years old, and she'd been left to the dubious mercy of a pack that had never wanted her in the first place. Roland stood before her on the raised platform where the pack alpha usually addressed important matters, and he was handsome in a conventional way, with his dark brown hair and strong jaw, and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having been told he was anything less than acceptable. And Celine had never loved him, but she'd been willing to try. Willing to make their arranged mating work, because it had seemed like her only chance at having a place to belong, at having someone who was required by law and custom to stand beside her, even if he didn't particularly want to. She'd been so foolishly, pathetically grateful 2 years ago when Alpha Marcus had suggested the arrangement, when Roland had agreed with what she'd thought was resigned acceptance, but what she now realized had been carefully hidden resentment. And she'd spent those 2 years trying to be useful, trying to be pleasant, trying to make herself into someone Roland could tolerate mating with, even if he couldn't love her. But clearly, all her efforts had been nothing more than wasted energy, because here they were, and he was looking at her like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock. I, Roland Blackthorne, beta of the Moonstone Pack, formally reject the arranged mating bond with Celine Frostborn. His voice rang out across the clearing with the kind of theatrical projection that made it clear he was performing for the audience rather than addressing her directly. And Celine felt something crack inside her chest. Something that had already been broken and badly patched together too many times to count, but was now shattering completely into pieces so small she didn't think she'd ever be able to put them back together again. I reject this bond on the grounds of fundamental incompatibility, on the grounds that the Omega before me is unsuited to stand beside a wolf of my station and my future responsibilities, and on the grounds that her very appearance suggests something unnatural, something cursed, something that the moon goddess herself seems to have marked as wrong and aberrant and unsuitable for the kind of strong, healthy bloodline that I intend to create with my true mate. The words hit Celine like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to cause maximum damage, and she stood there with her hands clenched at her sides and her nails digging crescents into her palms hard enough to draw blood, because if she focused on that small, controllable pain, then maybe she could ignore the much larger, uncontrollable pain that was radiating through her entire body, like poison spreading through her veins. She'd known this was coming, had felt it building for weeks in the way Roland avoided her and made excuses not to spend time with her, and looked through her rather than at her whenever they were forced to interact. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two entirely different things, and the reality of standing here in front of everyone she'd ever known while being publicly declared unworthy was so much worse than anything her imagination had conjured in her darkest moments of fear and self-doubt. "I have found my true mate," Roland continued, and his voice softened in a way it never had when he spoke to Celine, warming with genuine affection that made the contrast even more painful. "In Lydia Morningstar, an Omega of good breeding and normal appearance, an Omega who will bring honor to my name rather than shame, who will bear me strong pups rather than cursed offspring, who will stand beside me with pride rather than making everyone who sees us together wonder what tragedy of fate forced me to accept damaged goods." He extended his hand, and a beautiful Omega with glossy brown hair and warm amber eyes stepped up onto the platform beside him, and Celine recognized her as one of the pack members who'd always been particularly cruel in her mockery, who'd made comments about ghost blood and corpse coloring, and how it was no wonder Celine's parents had gotten themselves killed, since they'd created something so unnatural that the moon goddess herself must have been punishing them. The gathered pack erupted in applause and congratulations, and Celine watched through a haze of numbness as Roland pulled Lydia close and kissed her. And the easy affection between them was like salt being rubbed into wounds that were already raw and bleeding, because Roland had never touched Celine like that, had never looked at her with anything approaching desire or even basic fondness, and she tried so hard to tell herself that arranged matings didn't need to start with love, because love could grow over time with effort and patience and shared experiences. But now she understood that Roland had never intended to give their bond a chance to grow, had been searching for an escape from the moment Alpha Marcus had suggested the arrangement. And he'd found that escape in pretty, normal, acceptable Lydia, who would never make anyone uncomfortable just by existing. Alpha Marcus stepped forward then, an elderly wolf whose power had been fading for years, and who ruled more through tradition than actual strength or wisdom. And he looked at Celine with the kind of tired resignation that suggested he was washing his hands of a problem that had never been his responsibility in the first place. "Celine Frostborn," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent clearing. "Your betrothed has formally rejected you, and as is his right under pack law, you are no longer under his protection or obligation, and you must now choose your path forward." He paused, and Celine knew what was coming before he said it because she'd heard the whispers. Had known that Alpha Marcus was looking for an excuse to remove her from the pack entirely, rather than having to continue housing and feeding an Omega who contributed nothing but awkwardness and discomfort to pack dynamics. "You have two options before you. You may leave Moonstone Pack territory voluntarily and seek your fortune elsewhere, or you may accept Omega servant status within this pack, which would require you to surrender your personal autonomy and serve at the pleasure of higher-ranking wolves in exchange for basic food and shelter." Omega servant status was essentially slavery dressed up in prettier words, a position reserved for wolves who had committed crimes or who had no other options and no other value, and Celine knew that accepting such a position would mean a life of endless degradation and abuse from wolves who already looked down on her, who would take particular pleasure in having power over someone they'd always considered beneath them anyway. The choice wasn't really a choice at all, was nothing more than a formality to make it look like Alpha Marcus was being generous and giving her options when in reality, he was forcing her out in a way that wouldn't technically violate pack law or bring censure from the higher authorities, who occasionally checked on the outer territories to ensure alphas weren't abusing their power too egregiously. "I choose to leave," Celine said, and her voice came out stronger than she'd expected, clearer, with less of the trembling heartbreak that was churning through her stomach like a living thing. And she lifted her chin and met Alpha Marcus's eyes directly, even though Omegas weren't supposed to make direct eye contact with Alphas, because if she was leaving anyway, then pack protocol no longer mattered, and she was going to maintain whatever dignity she could salvage from this nightmare. "I will leave Moonstone Pack territory immediately, and I release all ties and obligations and connections to this pack from this moment forward." Alpha Marcus nodded, clearly relieved that she wasn't going to make a scene or cause problems, clearly glad to be rid of her with minimal fuss. "You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and vacate pack territory," he said, and then he turned away from her as if she'd already ceased to exist, as if she'd already faded into the kind of ghost she'd been accused of resembling her entire life, and the gathered wolves began to disperse, their entertainment concluded, their afternoon drama satisfied, already moving on to discussing dinner plans and evening activities, as if they hadn't just witnessed someone's entire world crumbling into dust and ashes. Celine walked through the dispersing crowd on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment, and no one met her eyes. No one offered sympathy or support. No one acknowledged that anything significant had just happened, and she made her way to the small room she'd been assigned in the Omega quarters, a tiny space barely large enough for a bed and a chest of drawers, but which had been home for 17 years since her parents died. She packed quickly and efficiently because she didn't own much. Just a few changes of clothes, and her mother's herb pouch that was the only thing she had left of her parents, and a small bag of dried food she'd been saving. And within 30 minutes, she was walking toward the pack border with everything she owned slung over her shoulder in a canvas bag that weighed almost nothing because her entire life apparently fit into a space smaller than most wolves' laundry baskets. The pack guards at the border watched her pass with expressions that ranged from indifference to poorly hidden satisfaction, and one of them, a young male she'd healed just 3 months ago when he'd been injured during training, couldn't even look at her as she walked by, couldn't acknowledge that she'd spent hours carefully stitching his wounds and preparing poultices and sitting with him through fever dreams to make sure he didn't die from infection. She crossed into neutral territory as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple that would have been beautiful if Celine had been capable of appreciating beauty in that moment. But all she could feel was a numbness spreading through her chest like ice, freezing everything it touched, shutting down her emotions before they could overwhelm her completely and leave her collapsed on the ground, sobbing like a child who'd lost everything that mattered. She walked for hours as the sunset faded into twilight, and twilight darkened into full night, and her feet began to bleed inside her worn boots, because she'd been too proud to ask for better shoes even though these had been falling apart for months. And finally, she couldn't walk anymore, couldn't force her legs to carry her another step, and she collapsed onto a fallen log beside a small stream in a clearing that was as good a place as any to rest, or possibly die, because at this point, she wasn't entirely sure which option she preferred. The moon was rising, full and silver, and achingly beautiful, and Celine looked up at it through the canopy of trees and felt tears finally beginning to fall. Hot and bitter and full of all the pain she'd been holding back since the moment Roland had started speaking. And she let herself cry for the first time since the rejection. Let herself feel the full weight of everything she'd lost, and everything she'd never have, and everything she'd spent her entire life hoping for that would now never come to pass. She removed her boots with trembling hands and examined her feet in the moonlight, finding them blistered and bleeding and swollen. And she pulled out her mother's herb pouch with fingers that shook so badly she almost dropped it. And she began mixing a simple healing salve, because even now, even when she was alone and rejected and possibly dying of exposure in the wilderness, her instinct was to heal, to mend, to try to fix what was broken, even though she had no idea how to fix the thing that was most shattered, which was her own heart and her own sense of worth, and her own belief that she deserved to exist in this world that had made it abundantly clear from the day she was born that she was unwanted and unwelcome, and fundamentally wrong in ways she could never change or correct. She was applying the salve to her ruined feet when she felt it, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck that told her she was being watched, that told her she was no longer alone, and she froze with her hands still on her ankle, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears, and she knew without turning around that whatever was watching her from the shadows of the trees was powerful, was dangerous, was something that could kill her without even trying if it chose to do so. And part of her thought that maybe being killed quickly by a predator would be a mercy compared to slowly dying of exposure or starvation or loneliness in these empty mountains. But another part of her, a part she hadn't known still existed after everything that had happened today, wanted desperately to survive, wanted to see what came next, wanted to know if there was anything beyond this pain waiting for her in the future that might possibly be worth the effort of continuing to draw breath. The scent hit her first, even before her eyes adjusted enough to make out the shapes moving in the darkness between the trees. And it was unlike anything Celine had ever encountered in her 24 years of life. A combination of pine forest, after winter rain, and cold mountain air, and something else. Something that smelled like power and dominance, and ancient bloodlines that stretched back through centuries of careful breeding and strategic alliances. Her wolf, which had been dormant and quiet inside her ever since the rejection ceremony had shattered something fundamental in her spirit, suddenly stirred to life with an urgency that felt almost violent, pressing against her consciousness with a desperation that made no sense given that they were clearly in danger from whatever apex predator was stalking them from the concealment of the forest shadows. And Celine's hands trembled as she slowly, carefully reached for the small knife she kept in her herb pouch, knowing even as she did so that such a pathetic weapon would be utterly useless against whatever was out there, but needing to hold something, needing to feel like she had even the smallest measure of control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling into territory that felt suspiciously like the moment before death. The first wolf stepped into the moonlight, and Celine's breath caught in her throat so sharply it was almost painful, because the creature before her was massive in a way that transcended normal wolf proportions, easily twice the size of any shifter she'd ever seen in their animal form, with shoulders that came up to what would be chest height on a full-grown human male, and paws that looked like they could crush bone with minimal effort. But it was the color that made her mind go blank with confusion, and something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition, because the wolf's fur was pure silver, not gray or white, or any of the normal variations that wolves displayed, but actual metallic silver that seemed to catch and reflect the moonlight as if the creature had been dipped in liquid mercury. And its eyes were equally unusual. A pale mercury silver that glowed with an intelligence that was definitely human, definitely aware, definitely evaluating her with the kind of careful assessment that suggested this was no mindless animal, but rather a shifter in wolf form who was making decisions about what to do with the trembling Omega who'd stumbled into their territory. 7 more wolves emerged from the trees behind the first, all of them equally massive, all of them moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military training and years of working together as a unit. And Celine realized with a sinking sensation in her stomach that she'd somehow managed to cross into the territory of an elite pack guard, the kind of warriors that served directly under alpha kings and territorial rulers, the kind of wolves who were trained to kill first and ask questions later when dealing with potential threats or trespassers. They formed a loose semicircle around her position on the fallen log, cutting off any potential escape routes, and Celine knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from understanding predator behavior that running would trigger their chase instinct and result in her death within seconds. So she remained frozen in place with her inadequate little knife clutched in one hand and her other hand still resting on her injured ankle, trying to make herself as small and non-threatening as possible, while her mind raced through options that all seemed to end with her torn apart and left for scavengers. The largest wolf, the silver one who'd emerged first, and who was clearly the alpha of this group, moved closer with steps that were deliberate and unhurried, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having encountered anything that could genuinely threaten him. And Celine found herself staring into those mercury silver eyes from a distance of less than 6 feet, close enough that she could see the individual hairs in his thick ruff and smell his scent even more strongly, that combination of winter and power and something else that made her wolf whine with a longing that felt completely inappropriate given their current circumstances. The alpha wolf tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made Celine feel like he was looking through her skin and bones directly into her soul, seeing all the broken pieces and damaged parts and worthless components that made up the sum total of who she was, and she waited for the attack that would surely come. Waited for those massive jaws to close around her throat and end this nightmare of a day with the mercy of oblivion. But instead, the wolf did something completely unexpected and utterly confusing. He sat down, lowering his haunches to the ground in a posture that was somehow both regal and non-threatening, and he continued to watch her with those unsettling eyes that seemed to glow brighter in the darkness, and the other wolves in his pack followed his lead, sitting in their semicircle formation and watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and assessment, but none of the immediate aggression she'd been expecting. Celine's mind struggled to process this development, struggled to understand why an elite pack guard would corner a lone Omega and then simply sit there watching her like she was some kind of puzzle they were trying to solve. And her wolf was still acting completely insane inside her head, pushing at her consciousness with images and sensations that made no sense, showing her flashes of silver fur and mercury eyes and a feeling of rightness and home and mine that was so absurd given their situation that Celine wondered if the stress of the day had finally broken something important in her psyche. "I'm sorry," Celine heard herself saying, and her voice came out rough and shaking, but audible, carrying across the clearing to the assembled wolves who were all watching her with that same unnerving intensity. "I didn't realize I'd crossed into claimed territory. I wasn't paying attention to the boundary markers because I was just trying to get away from my old pack after they rejected me, and I'll leave immediately if you'll allow me to gather my things and go. I have no intention of causing problems or infringing on your territory, or doing anything that might be perceived as a threat to your pack or your alpha." The words tumbled out in a rush, desperate and pleading, and Celine hated the sound of her own voice begging for mercy from wolves who probably couldn't even understand her in their animal forms. But she couldn't seem to stop herself from trying to explain, trying to make them understand that she was nobody, nothing, not worth the effort of killing or even remembering once she was gone from their territory and their lives. The silver alpha wolf made a sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't quite a whine either. Something low and complex that conveyed meaning she couldn't interpret. And then he rose to his feet and moved even closer. Close enough that Celine could have reached out and touched him if she'd been brave enough or stupid enough to try such a thing. And she held her breath as he lowered his massive head and sniffed at her. His nose nearly touching her hair, and then her neck, and then the rejection mark that Roland had left there. The place where his partial claim had been torn away when he'd spoken the words that severed their arranged bond. The alpha wolf's entire body went rigid when his nose touched that mark, and a sound emerged from his throat that was definitely a growl this time, low and threatening, and filled with a rage that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. And Selena felt terror spike through her veins like ice water, because clearly she'd done something to offend him. Clearly the scent of her rejection was somehow insulting or disgusting, and she was going to die here in this clearing after all, killed by wolves who found even the evidence of her unworthiness too offensive to tolerate. But the attack didn't come, and instead, the alpha wolf pulled back and turned to the other wolves, making a series of sounds that were clearly communication, clearly orders being given and received. And three of the wolves immediately stood and disappeared into the forest, while the others remained in their positions watching her. And Celine had no idea what was happening, had no framework for understanding this situation that seemed to be following rules and protocols she didn't know existed. Time stretched out in strange ways, minutes feeling like hours as she sat there with her bleeding feet and her trembling hands and her completely inadequate knife, watching the silver alpha wolf, who was watching her with an expression that would have been easier to read if he'd been in human form, but which seemed to convey something more complex than simple threat assessment. Something that looked almost like concern, mixed with anger, mixed with a fierce protectiveness that made absolutely no sense, given that they were strangers and she was nothing, and he had no reason to care whether she lived or died. The three wolves returned perhaps 20 minutes later, though Celine's sense of time had become unreliable, so it might have been 10 minutes, or it might have been an hour. And they were accompanied by something that made Celine's heart stop completely in her chest before resuming at double speed, because walking into the clearing behind the wolves were 8 human figures, all male, all dressed in the kind of formal military uniforms that marked them as elite guards in service to one of the great territorial alphas, and their presence meant that she'd made an even more catastrophic mistake than she'd realized, had somehow stumbled into the path of wolves so important and so powerful that they traveled with armed guards who could shift between forms at will and coordinate attacks in ways that made them the deadliest warriors in the werewolf world. The silver wolf, who'd been watching her so intently, stood and moved to the side, and Celine watched in fascinated horror as his form began to shimmer and shift, bones cracking and reforming and muscles rippling under fur that receded to reveal skin. And within seconds, where the massive wolf had been sitting, there was now a man, naked as shifters always were after transformation, but somehow making nudity look like a deliberate choice rather than an embarrassing necessity. He was tall, easily several inches over 6 feet, with a powerful build that suggested both strength and speed, and his hair was the same metallic silver as his wolf form had been, falling to his shoulders in thick waves that caught the moonlight and seemed to glow with an inner luminescence that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. His eyes were that same mercury silver color, pale and intense and fixed on Celine with a focus that made her want to look away, but also made it impossible to do so. And his face was all sharp angles and aristocratic features that spoke of generations of careful bloodline management and strategic breeding programs designed to concentrate power and beauty in equal measures. But it was the aura of absolute authority that surrounded him like a visible force field that made Celine's wolf flatten submissively inside her mind, that made every instinct she possessed scream at her to lower her eyes and bare her throat and show submission to an alpha so far above her station that they might as well belong to different species entirely. And when he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding, and filled with the kind of power that made reality itself seem to bend slightly in his direction. "Who rejected you?" The question came out as a demand rather than an inquiry, and Celine found herself answering before her conscious mind could catch up with her mouth, responding to the sheer force of will behind those 4 words, with the kind of automatic obedience that all omegas were conditioned to show to dominant alphas, especially alphas who radiated power the way this man did, like he was the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. "Beta Roland Blackthorn of Moonstone Pack, Your Majesty," she heard herself saying, and the title slipped out without her conscious decision to use it because she'd suddenly recognized the silver hair and the elite guards and the absolute authority, had suddenly understood that she was looking at the Alpha King himself, Theron Silvercrest, ruler of the entire Northern Territories and lord over 47 packs, including her own former home. And the realization made her hands shake so badly she dropped her knife, made her breathing become rapid and shallow as panic rose in her throat like bile. Because if she'd known she was in the presence of royalty, she never would have spoken so casually, never would have dared to meet his eyes, never would have done any of the dozen things she'd already done that could be interpreted as disrespect or insubordination. Theron Silvercrest's expression darkened at her answer, his jaw clenching and his eyes flashing with something that looked like barely contained fury. And one of the guards quickly stepped forward and draped a cloak around the king's shoulders, covering his nudity in a gesture that suggested this was routine protocol, something they did without needing to be asked. "When?" The single word cracked through the clearing like a whip, and Celine flinched despite her best efforts to maintain some shred of composure, despite her desperate desire to appear calm and rational, and not like the pathetic, broken thing she knew herself to be. "This afternoon, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of night insects and the gentle burble of the nearby stream. "The ceremony was held at sunset, and I left Moonstone Territory immediately afterward, and I've been walking for several hours, trying to put distance between myself and everything I've ever known, and I swear I didn't realize I'd crossed into your territory. I wasn't paying attention to the markers because I was too focused on just moving forward, and I apologize profusely for the intrusion, and I'll leave immediately, if you'll just allow me to gather my things." The king stared at her for a long moment, and Celine couldn't read the expression on his face, couldn't interpret the complex mixture of emotions that seemed to be playing across his aristocratic features, and she felt her wolf doing something completely insane inside her mind, pushing forward with a strength she hadn't known the creature possessed, trying to force a shift that Celine desperately held back, because the last thing she needed was to shift in front of the Alpha King and his guards, to expose herself even further to the scrutiny of wolves who were so far above her station that they probably considered her less than nothing, barely worth acknowledging except as a nuisance to be removed from their presence. "You will come with us," Theron said finally, and his voice had dropped to a tone that was somehow more commanding than when he'd been shouting, a quiet intensity that made it absolutely clear this was not a request or a suggestion, but an order that would be obeyed regardless of what Celine wanted or how she felt about the situation. "We're returning to Moonstone Pack immediately, and you will accompany us because I have questions about your rejection that require answers. Questions that cannot wait for formal channels or written reports or any of the usual bureaucratic processes that would normally handle such matters." Celine felt the blood drain from her face as horror washed through her in waves that made her dizzy, made her vision blur at the edges, and her stomach clench with nausea that had nothing to do with physical illness and everything to do with the prospect of returning to the place that had just cast her out, of facing Roland and Lydia and Alpha Marcus and everyone else who'd made it abundantly clear that she was unwanted and unwelcome and fundamentally wrong in ways that could never be corrected or forgiven. "Please," she heard herself begging, and she hated the desperate pleading in her voice, but couldn't seem to stop the words from pouring out, couldn't seem to maintain any dignity in the face of this nightmare scenario. "Please don't make me go back there. I can't face them again. I can't stand in front of that pack and be humiliated further. Whatever questions you have, I'll answer them here. Right now, I'll tell you anything you want to know. But please, please don't make me go back." Her voice broke on the last word, tears streaming down her face without her permission, and she was dimly aware that she was having some kind of breakdown in front of the most powerful wolf in the territories, that she was showing weakness and emotional instability to an alpha who probably valued strength and control above all else. But she couldn't stop herself, couldn't hold back the tide of panic and grief and exhaustion that was overwhelming her completely. Theron moved then, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, and Celine found herself looking up at him from her position on the fallen log, found herself surrounded by his presence and his scent and the sheer, overwhelming force of his dominance. And she waited for the reprimand, waited for him to command her to control herself and stop being so pathetically emotional, waited for the disgust that she'd seen so many times in other wolves' eyes when they looked at her and found her lacking in every possible way. But instead of disgust, instead of irritation or contempt, what she saw in those mercury silver eyes when he crouched down to her eye level was something that looked almost like understanding, almost like compassion, almost like he could see the broken pieces of her soul, and rather than being repelled by them, he was somehow drawn to them, somehow moved by her pain in a way that made no sense, given that he was a king and she was nobody, and there was no logical reason for him to care about the suffering of one insignificant Omega who'd been stupid enough to believe she deserved better than what the world had decided to give her. "You have my word that you will not be harmed," Theron said, and his voice was gentler now, softer, carrying a note of something that might have been tenderness if such a thing were possible from a wolf of his power and position, and he reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement clearly so she could pull away if she wanted to, and when she didn't move, he carefully, gently wiped the tears from her face with his thumb. The gesture so unexpectedly kind that it made Celine cry harder, made the broken pieces inside her chest crack even further apart. "I give you my personal protection, my sworn oath as Alpha King that no wolf will touch you or harm you or humiliate you further while you are under my care. And I promise you that there are reasons for what I'm doing, reasons that I cannot explain here in this clearing, but which will become clear once we reach Moonstone territory, and I can address the situation properly." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost vulnerable despite the power that radiated from every inch of his body. I understand that you're afraid, that you've been hurt in ways that make trust nearly impossible. But I'm asking you to trust me anyway. Just for tonight. Just long enough to let me do what needs to be done. And tomorrow I swear on my bloodline and my crown that you'll have choices, that you'll have options, that you'll never again be forced into a situation where you have no control over your own fate. The sincerity in his voice, the unexpected gentleness in his touch, the way he was looking at her like she actually mattered, like her pain and fear were important enough to acknowledge and address rather than dismiss or ignore. All of it combined to break through Celine's panic just enough to let rational thought creep back in. And she found herself nodding, even though every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to run, to do anything except agree to return to the place that had destroyed her. "I'll come with you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, and she saw something that looked like relief flash across Theron's aristocratic features before his expression settled back into the mask of controlled authority that probably served him well when dealing with pack politics and territorial disputes and all the other complicated matters that came with ruling an entire region of werewolf territories. He stood and offered her his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Celine placed her smaller, paler hand in his larger, stronger one, feeling a jolt of something electric and inexplicable pass between them at the point of contact, something that made her wolf howl with recognition and made her own heart skip several beats in rapid succession. And as he pulled her gently to her feet and kept her hand in his while gesturing for his guards to prepare the horses, Celine couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand, that whatever was waiting for her back at Moonstone Pack was going to reshape her understanding of everything she thought she knew about fate and destiny and the mysterious workings of the moon goddess who supposedly guided all their paths through this complicated existence. The guards moved with efficient precision, bringing forward horses that had apparently been waiting nearby, and Celine realized with a mixture of awe and terror that the Alpha King traveled with a full contingent that included not just warriors, but also supplies and mounts, the kind of traveling party that suggested he was on official business rather than casual patrol. And she wondered what had brought him to this particular stretch of neutral territory at this particular moment, whether it was coincidence or fate or something else entirely that had put her in his path mere hours after she'd been cast out from the only home she'd ever known. One of the guards approached her with concern evident in his expression, clearly having been ordered to help her onto a horse despite her obvious inexperience with riding, and as she was lifted into the saddle and positioned in front of a warrior who would keep her from falling during the journey ahead, as they began the ride back toward Moonstone territory, with the Alpha King leading the way on a magnificent black stallion, and his silver hair streaming behind him in the wind like a banner of liquid moonlight. Celine couldn't help but think that she'd somehow fallen from one nightmare directly into another, except this nightmare came wrapped in concern and protection, and the unsettling feeling that Theron Silvercrest knew something about her situation that she didn't. Something important. Something that would explain why the most powerful alpha in the territories had taken a personal interest in one broken, rejected, silver-haired Omega who by all rights should have been beneath his notice entirely. The ride back to Moonstone Pack took less time than Celine's earlier desperate flight away from it had taken, but every minute felt like an eternity stretched out on a rack of anticipation and dread, and she sat rigidly in front of the guard who'd been assigned to keep her safely mounted, her body tense with the effort of not thinking about what awaited her at journey's end, not imagining the faces of the wolves who'd watched her humiliation with satisfaction and would now see her return in the company of the Alpha King himself as some kind of cosmic joke or divine punishment for daring to exist in a way that made them uncomfortable. The night air was cold against her tear-stained face, and she could see Theron riding ahead of them on his magnificent stallion. His silver hair catching the moonlight in a way that was so similar to her own that it created a visual echo between them. A connection that went beyond mere coincidence and spoke to something deeper, something her rational mind wanted to dismiss, but her wolf insisted was important, was meaningful, was the answer to questions she hadn't known she needed to ask, until she'd looked into those mercury silver eyes and felt her entire world tilt sideways on its axis. They reached Moonstone territory just after midnight, and Selene could see lights blazing in the main compound, where clearly the entire pack had been roused from sleep by news of the Alpha King's unexpected return, and she felt her stomach clench with anxiety so intense it was almost physically painful as they rode through the gates and into the central clearing, where just hours ago she'd been publicly rejected and cast out like garbage no one wanted to deal with anymore. The assembled pack members gasped when they saw her sitting on the horse in the midst of the king's guard, and Selene could hear the whispers starting already, confused questions about why she'd returned and what it meant that she was traveling with the most powerful alpha in the territories. And she wanted to sink into the ground and disappear, wanted to be anywhere except here, facing these wolves who'd made their opinion of her worth abundantly clear when they'd stood by and watched Roland tear apart what little dignity she'd possessed. Theron dismounted with fluid grace and immediately moved to Selene's horse, reaching up to help her down before the guard could do so, and his hands on her waist were gentle but firm as he lifted her from the saddle and set her carefully on the ground, keeping one hand on her elbow to steady her when her injured feet protested bearing weight after hours of being relatively still. Alpha Marcus emerged from the pack house, looking disheveled and nervous, clearly having been pulled from bed and not given time to make himself presentable before greeting his unexpected royal visitor. And behind him came Roland, with Lydia clinging to his arm, both of them looking confused and somewhat afraid, as if they sensed that something significant was about to happen but couldn't quite grasp what it might be or how it might affect them personally. "Your Majesty," Alpha Marcus began, his voice carrying the kind of forced joviality that people used when they were trying to appear confident despite being terrified of the person they were addressing. "What an unexpected honor to have you return so quickly. Though I must confess I'm confused about why you've brought back the Omega we cast out earlier today. Surely there hasn't been some mistake or misunderstanding about the situation." Theron's expression could have frozen fire, and Selene felt the temperature in the clearing seem to drop several degrees as he turned the full force of his attention on the elderly Alpha, who was suddenly looking much less confident and much more like a wolf who'd just realized he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment that was about to have severe consequences. "There has indeed been a mistake," Theron said, and his voice carried across the assembled pack with the kind of authority that made it impossible to ignore or dismiss. The kind of power that reminded everyone present exactly who held ultimate control over their lives and their futures and their continued existence within the territorial structure that governed werewolf society. "Beta Roland Blackthorn, step forward and explain to me the grounds on which you rejected your arranged mate this afternoon, and be very specific about your reasoning because I'm extremely interested in understanding what could possibly justify such a decision." Roland stepped forward with Lydia still attached to his arm like a barnacle on a ship's hull, and Selene could see the uncertainty in his expression, could see him trying to calculate what answer the king wanted to hear versus what answer was actually true. And she felt a grim satisfaction watching him squirm under the weight of royal attention, even as part of her wanted to simply vanish so she wouldn't have to relive this nightmare. "Your Majesty, I rejected Selene Frostborn because she's unsuitable for a wolf of my station and my future responsibilities," Roland said, and his voice was less confident than it had been during the afternoon ceremony, less certain that his reasoning would be accepted and validated by those listening. "Her appearance is unnatural, cursed-looking, not the kind of thing that would bring honor to my bloodline or produce strong, healthy offspring. And I found my true mate in Lydia Morningstar, who is everything that Selene is not. Normal and beautiful and acceptable by any standard you might care to apply." Theron's eyes flashed silver, a sign that his wolf was very close to the surface and not particularly pleased with what it was hearing, and Selene watched in fascinated horror as the Alpha King reached up and deliberately, slowly ran his fingers through his own silver hair, drawing every eye in the clearing to the metallic sheen that was identical to Selene's own unusual coloring. "You rejected her because of her silver hair," Theron said, and it wasn't a question, but rather a statement of fact that hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. "You rejected her because of her pale skin and her unusual eye color, because of physical characteristics that you deemed unnatural and cursed, because her appearance made you uncomfortable, and you couldn't imagine binding yourself to someone who looked so different from what you considered normal and acceptable." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the pack see where this was heading before he delivered the killing blow. "Tell me, Beta Roland, do you find my appearance unnatural as well, given that I share these same physical characteristics, given that silver hair and pale skin are the genetic markers of the royal bloodline that has ruled these territories for 15 generations, given that what you call cursed is actually the visible sign of divine favor bestowed by the moon goddess herself on those she deems worthy of leadership and power?" The clearing erupted in shocked gasps and whispers as the assembled wolves finally understood the trap that Roland had walked into, as they realized that by rejecting Selene for traits she shared with their king, he'd essentially declared the entire royal bloodline to be unnatural and cursed. And Selene watched Roland's face go white as paper as the implications of his words crashed down on him like an avalanche he had no hope of escaping. "Your Majesty, I didn't mean to imply anything about the royal family. I would never suggest that your bloodline was anything less than blessed and honored. I only meant that in common wolves like Selene, such traits are unusual and therefore suspect, whereas in wolves of your elevated station, they're clearly marks of divine favor and—" Theron cut him off with a gesture that was as effective as a physical blow, his expression carved from ice and just as cold, and Selene realized that she was watching a master politician at work, watching someone who understood exactly how to use words and timing and public perception to achieve his goals with surgical precision. "You rejected your mate not due to incompatibility or mutual agreement, but due to prejudice against genetic traits that are shared by your ruling bloodline," Theron said, his voice ringing with finality, with judgment, with the kind of authority that made arguing seem not just futile, but actually dangerous to attempt. "This is an illegal rejection under territorial law, which requires that all rejections be based on legitimate grounds and approved by the presiding alpha to prevent exactly this kind of abuse of power and discrimination. And furthermore, it constitutes an insult to the crown that cannot be overlooked or forgiven, regardless of whatever excuses or explanations you might attempt to offer." He turned to his captain of guards, his voice sharp with command that brooked no discussion or delay. "Strip Roland Blackthorn of his beta title effective immediately and banish him from Moonstone Pact territory. He has 1 hour to gather his belongings and leave, and if he's found within these borders after that deadline passes, he will be arrested and brought to the capital to face formal charges of discrimination and illegal rejection." The guards moved forward immediately to enforce the order, and Lydia began crying and protesting that it wasn't fair, that Roland had done nothing wrong, that he shouldn't be punished for wanting a normal mate instead of someone who looked like a ghost, and Celine felt a strange mixture of vindication and emptiness watching Roland being led away to pack his things under armed supervision, watching the man who'd humiliated her just hours ago, now facing consequences that seemed almost too severe for the crime, even though part of her wanted him to suffer the way she'd suffered, wanted him to feel the pain of rejection and exile, and having everything he'd taken for granted suddenly stripped away without warning or mercy. Theron turned to Alpha Marcus next, and the elderly wolf looked like he wanted to sink into the ground and disappear, looked like he'd suddenly realized that his handling of the situation had been observed and judged and found severely lacking by the one person whose opinion actually mattered in terms of his continued authority over this territory. You will reform your pack's treatment of omegas. You will establish clear protocols for handling rejections that include my approval before they're made official, and you will ensure that no wolf under your authority is ever again discriminated against for physical characteristics that are beyond their control," Theron said, and his tone made it clear that these were not suggestions or recommendations, but orders that would be followed, or Alpha Marcus would find himself replaced by someone who understood that leadership meant protecting the vulnerable rather than enabling their abuse. "I'll be sending an inspector next month to verify compliance, and if I find that you've failed to implement these changes or that you've allowed continued mistreatment of any pack member based on appearance or rank, or any other arbitrary factor, I will replace you with someone who actually understands what it means to lead with justice and compassion, rather than just maintaining whatever status quo makes your life easiest." Then Theron did something that made the entire assembled pack go completely silent, something that would be talked about in whispers and stories for generations to come, something that fundamentally changed everything. Celine thought she understood about her situation and her future and her place in the world that had spent 24 years making her feel like she didn't deserve to exist. He turned to face her directly, his mercury silver eyes meeting her violet gray ones with an intensity that made her breath catch and her heart race. And he reached out to take both of her hands in his, holding them gently while the entire pack watched in stunned silence, while Alpha Marcus and the guards and every wolf present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would alter the course of multiple lives in ways none of them could fully comprehend yet. "Bring her to my chambers," Theron said, his voice carrying across the clearing with absolute authority. And every wolf present understood exactly what those words meant, understood that the Alpha King was claiming the rejected Omega for himself in a display of protection and favor that was so far beyond anything that made logical sense that it could only be interpreted one way, could only mean one thing, that sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd and made Celine's mind go blank with disbelief and confusion and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Bring the Omega Celine to my chambers immediately. Provide her with clean clothing and medical attention for her injuries and anything else she requires, and make it clear to everyone present that she is now under my direct protection, that harming her or insulting her or showing her anything less than the respect due to someone who holds my personal favor will be considered an attack on me personally and will be punished accordingly." The pack exploded in whispers and shocked exclamations, and Celine felt her knees go weak as the implications crashed over her in waves that threatened to sweep her away completely, and Theron steadied her with his hands still holding hers, his touch gentle and reassuring, even as his expression remained commanding and unyielding when he looked at the assembled wolves, who were staring at them both with expressions ranging from shock to awe to calculation about what this development might mean for their own positions and prospects. "You have nothing to fear," he said softly, speaking directly to her in a tone meant only for her ears, even though everyone could see his lips moving, could see the tenderness in his expression that was such a stark contrast to the icy authority he'd shown just moments ago. I know you don't understand yet. I know this seems impossible and overwhelming and probably terrifying. But I promise you that tomorrow everything will make sense. Tomorrow you'll have choices and options and explanations. But tonight, you just need to trust me enough to let my people take care of you. To let yourself be protected and valued and treated the way you should have been treated your entire life. Female Omegas from the pack came forward nervously to escort Celine to the guest chambers, clearly terrified of making any mistake that might anger the king, who was watching their every move with the intensity of a predator, evaluating potential threats to something precious. And Celine allowed herself to be led away on trembling legs that barely supported her weight, allowed herself to be bathed and bandaged and dressed in fine clothing that felt strange, against skin that was used to rough fabric and hand-me-downs, allowed herself to be brought to luxurious chambers that were so far beyond anything she'd experienced that she felt like an imposter, like someone playing dress-up in a life that belonged to someone else, someone worthy and valuable and actually deserving of the attention the Alpha King had inexplicably bestowed upon her. When Theron entered the chamber an hour later, properly clothed now in formal attire that somehow made him look even more commanding than he had while naked after shifting, Celine was sitting by the fireplace trying to process everything that had happened in a span of hours, that had seen her go from rejected and exiled to protected and claimed by the most powerful wolf in the territories. And she looked up at him with questions written all over her face, with confusion and disbelief and a desperate need to understand what was happening and why he was doing this and what it all meant for her future, that suddenly seemed impossibly vast and terrifying in its potential. "You're my mate," Theron said simply, sitting down across from her and speaking the words that explained everything and nothing simultaneously, that answered questions she hadn't known how to ask, and raised hundreds more that crowded into her mind, demanding attention. "From the moment I caught your scent on the wind, from the moment I saw you sitting in that clearing with your silver hair, catching moonlight and your spirit broken but not destroyed, my wolf recognized you as the one the moon goddess created specifically for me. The one I've been searching for without even realizing I was searching. The one who would complete me and challenge me and stand beside me as my equal, even though our ranks suggest we're separated by an unbridgeable gap." He leaned forward, his expression intense but also vulnerable in a way that suggested this admission cost him something, that revealing this truth made him feel exposed in ways he wasn't accustomed to experiencing. "I didn't tell you immediately because you'd just been rejected, because you were traumatized and broken and in no state to hear that another alpha was claiming you, because I needed you to understand that I chose you not out of pity or political maneuvering, but because of who you are, because your silver hair that others called cursed is actually a mark of royal bloodline that runs through your veins from some ancestor you never knew about, because everything about you calls to everything about me in ways that transcend logic or reason or any explanation beyond the simple fact that the moon goddess made us for each other and brought us together at exactly the moment we both needed it most." Celine stared at him, tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time that day. But these were different tears, tears of relief and overwhelming emotion, and something that felt like the beginning of healing after years of believing she was fundamentally broken beyond repair. And she found herself nodding, even though she couldn't quite form words yet, found herself accepting this impossible truth because her wolf was screaming yes, and her heart was beating in rhythm with his, and everything about this moment felt right in ways that nothing else in her entire life had ever felt right before. "I choose you," she whispered finally, her voice rough but steady, growing stronger with each word as she spoke the truth that had been building inside her chest since the moment he'd wiped away her tears in the clearing. "Not because you're a king, or because you saved me from exile, or because you gave me protection and honor in front of the pack that rejected me, but because when you look at me, you see someone worth choosing, someone worth protecting, someone worth the effort of being patient and gentle and kind, even though you could have just commanded my compliance and I would have had no choice but to obey, because you gave me choices when I thought I had none left, because you made me feel valued for the first time in my life, because your silver hair matches mine, and that feels like the moon goddess telling us we were always meant to find each other, no matter how long or how painful the journey to this moment became." They talked through the night, Selene sharing stories of her childhood and her loneliness and the years of learning to make herself invisible, and Theron sharing his own struggles with isolation at the top of the power structure, where everyone wanted something from him, but few people actually saw him as anything beyond his crown and his authority. And as dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, they both understood that they'd been given something rare and precious and worth protecting, a genuine connection that transcended rank and circumstance, and all the complicated factors that normally dictated relationships between alphas and omegas in their structured society. Within a week, Selene had moved to the capital. Within a month, she was training formally with the royal healers and discovering depths of magical talent she hadn't known she possessed. Within 3 months, they held a mating ceremony that was attended by every major pack in the territories, and within a year she stood beside Theron as his crowned Luna, his equal partner in ruling with justice and compassion, and the kind of wisdom that comes from understanding what it means to be powerless and choosing to use power to protect rather than dominate. Years later, when young Omegas came to her feeling rejected and worthless and broken by a world that had judged them for things beyond their control, Luna Selene would take their hands and look into their eyes and tell them the truth that she'd learned on the worst day of her life that had somehow transformed into the best thing that ever happened to her. Would tell them that sometimes the moon goddess has to strip away everything we think we want in order to give us what we actually need. That rejection is often just redirection toward a destiny we couldn't have imagined when we were still clinging to what was familiar, even if it was slowly killing us. That the traits we've been taught to see as curses are often actually blessings we haven't learned to recognize yet, and that somewhere out there, the right person is waiting. The person who will look at us and see not our flaws, but our value, not our differences, but our uniqueness, not our brokenness, but our strength forged through surviving things that should have destroyed us but somehow didn't, and that when we find that person, or they find us, everything that came before, all the pain and loneliness and rejection, will suddenly make sense as part of the journey that led us to exactly where we were always meant to be all along. If you enjoyed Selene and Theron's story of rejection, redemption, and discovering that what the world calls cursed is often actually blessed, please let me know what you thought in the comments below, because I love hearing which parts of these werewolf romance tales resonate most strongly with readers who understand that true strength comes not from never being broken, but from choosing to keep going even after you've been shattered into pieces. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss future stories about alpha kings and rejected mates and fated bonds that transcend the limitations society tries to place on love, and hit the notification bell to be alerted whenever I upload new content exploring themes of worthiness, acceptance, transformation, and the mysterious ways the moon goddess guides us toward our destinies. Even when the path seems impossibly dark and we're certain we'll never find our way to the light that's waiting just beyond the next turn in the road we're traveling.